Books.
Books. Welcome back to StoryTube. What's the story? We are here to tell you what we've been reading in the last month. And the answer is kind of everything.
Every genre, every medium.
It was fun to compile the books. I have read 5 novels and 2 comics. The 5 novels are 5 different genres, which is pretty on brand. And pretty cool.
Yeah, this month I've been a bit scattered. I mean, what else is new? I feel like I say that all the time. I just said before we sat down to film, I'm in a transient state of flow. I picked up a lot of things this month, not really settling on anything. There was a little period where I couldn't really read at all in the middle of the month. So, it's all over the place. I'll also mention some things that I've started I'm in, and then I'll save, deeper thoughts about those for the next wrap-up. You know what this is. Let's get on with it. Shall we get on with it?
Let's get on with it.
Yeah.
Well, the first book that I picked up in February made somebody very happy, and that was Planetfall by Emma Newman. This is a book that Carlos really loves. You read it 4 years ago, something like that at this point, and have been telling me to read it ever since. And a part of me has been putting it off because I was worried about not being in the right mindset, because this is a science fiction with a heavy focus on mental health. And specifically in this book, it's anxiety and OCD, and I wanted to be in a good headspace so it wouldn't trigger me. And another part of it is that I think I still have a little bit of a blocker sometimes when it comes to science fiction that isn't fun space opera or dystopia, because I am not into like techie talk, and it becomes a bit of a blocker in terms of me getting into that story in the beginning and understanding concepts and such. This book sounded a little bit like that reading the back of it, but is not like that at all. I actually found it incredibly accessible in terms of the sci-fi of it all, mostly because it's a very, very close first person. I mean, obviously first person is close, but we're very much in one person's head the entire time, and it's about the inner workings of that person's head. That is what this book is about. Everything else is kind of a bit of window dressing, and that really carried me into the story very, very quickly and through the story, and I had absolutely no issues with the sci-fi elements of it. And the result, honestly, is that this is kind of a psychological thriller, only it happens to be set in space with a cult and maybe or maybe not aliens, and I loved it. This is so good, and I found it so easy to read, even though sometimes it was very tough and challenging in terms of the subject matter, but in terms of the prose and the story, very, very easy to just keep going. It's also a relatively short book. It's like 320 pages, which helps. I've been in that kind of mood. And it did hit very close to home a couple of times throughout the story. There were a few times where I was like, oh, Emma Newman is sitting in my walls watching me, and she has been taking notes, and she is now judging, but also offering me some chocolate.
All right.
There's no chocolate in this book. I don't know where that came from. Planetfall is great. What makes it even more great is that it's both a standalone and a series at the same time, because this is one contained story. It's one book. It has a satisfying ending, but if you love it like I loved it, it might make you want to read more, because there are hints in here about what might be happening on Earth while we're here away in space, and that's what the sequel is about. So it's 4 books. They're interconnected, but each book is very much its own story, right?
Yeah, I would say that books 2 and 4 go together.
Cool.
So if you read book 2, book 4 is a direct sequel to that. Books 1 and 3, so Planetfall and Before Mars, completely standalone. You can also read book 2 After Atlas as a standalone, but if you want a direct sequel to that, which you probably will because that ending is a motherfucker, Atlas Alone, the 4th book, is a direct sequel to that. So I'd say the only book you can't read on its own is number 4.
See, so you you don't have to commit to a 4-book series to read Planetfall. And if you want more about the whole series, you made a video about that we can link.
Yeah, there's a absolutely extraordinary video on the channel.
Yes.
About Planetfall made by me.
It is extraordinary.
Groundbreaking, actually. Well, in our last wrap-up, I talked about 3 Percival Everett books, and I said that I would be reading more. And I did. I read 2 more. I intended to read 3 more, but then I got a bit scattered halfway through the month. You will see. You'll see. But I read Wounded and I Am Not Sidney Poitier. And I think Wounded might be my favourite Percival Everett so far. I'm not 100% sure. But a little bit... They're all fairly different, but Percival Everett has a style, a type, an archetype of protagonist that he just plucks and pops into different stories. But the thing that I liked most about Wounded is that it is also the most character-driven and plot-focused so far, maybe aside from James. Just that balance between riveting plot and exceptional character. But also the dialogue in this book is so good. It is so sharp. He doesn't overstate anything. It's somewhat understated. It's just real. It is real. It's authentic. You get so much about people's personalities and how they speak and how they react to things in this book. And Wounded is basically a crime neo-western, basically. It's about a black horse trainer in Wyoming, in like small town Wyoming. He works on a ranch and he's a horse trainer, and that's kind of unusual in a sort of white dominated cowboy country. It's set in present day, in modern times, and it's basically this guy and his uncle running this ranch. They have basically a ranch hand who has come to work with them for a few weeks, and he gets accused of killing a gay man in the town. And it kind of starts all of these conversations between people about tolerance and intolerance and hate crimes. It kind of kickstarts this semi-tale of dealing with pain. Everybody in this book is wounded. And also handling feelings of wanting to get revenge on those who inflict that pain. And where does the threshold between pain and hate lie? And how is hate perpetuated? And it's all through the eyes of this very mild-mannered, well-spoken, kind of the typical Percival Everett protagonist archetype. He's very well-spoken, very calm, composed, measured, in a very heightened situation. And it's essentially, it's a crime novel, but this sort of neo-western. It's set modern day, it's western. It's got that kind of tone to it. So if you like that kind of stuff, I think Wounded is right up there. Wounded is right up there with the westerns I've read by McCarthy and McMurtry now, in my opinion. It's right up there. I think this book is deeply in conversation with those two authors. And there's also a little bit of Steinbeck in there in terms of his sensibilities. So I think this one might be my favourite Percival Everett so far, just because it also ticks my taste boxes. That's Wounded. Nice. I highly recommend it. I read that with our friend Evie, who was looking to try a Percival Everett, and I told her that this one had horses in it. And yeah, she loved it. Because she loves horses. There's a lot about nature, and the main character, basically, he breaks horses. So if there's a horse going a bit crazy, going a bit wild, a horse in pain, and he calms that horse, he goes on a sort of a journey with it. That sort of mirrors in the opposite direction some of the journeys the characters in the book go on. And that's very Steinbeck of him. So there you go. Wounded by Percival Everett. I think that is honestly a little bit of a hidden gem, a masterwork. So that's that one. Then I read I Am Not Sidney Poitier, which I was excited to get to because I hadn't really watched Sidney Poitier movies since I was a kid, and I remember liking them. And this just sounded very funny, a little bit absurd. It is about a man who goes by the name of not Sidney Poitier, and he grows up to look kind of exactly like Sidney Poitier. And this is Percival Everett's Odyssey novel. It is taking a character. This is clearly heavily inspired by something like Ulysses or those kinds of books that take a character in a place, in a country, and just kind of put them on this sort of seemingly random journey, odyssey, through America, through the land. And not Sidney Poitier is a kind of a character that represents class and race relations in the US. He's from quite a wealthy background, and because of his travels through certain parts of America, that works against him in the sense that people just don't believe that he is as wealthy as he is. He gets into all sorts of shenanigans, and each chapter in the book kind of is a little playful retelling of some premises of Sidney Poitier movies. So if you know any Sidney Poitier movies, you'll see chapters that resemble the Defiant ones, where a black and a white prisoner are chained together, running through the fields and all that kind of stuff. You'll see Guess Who's Coming to Dinner in here. Probably my favourite part of the book. I think maybe the Defiant ones might have been my favourite part of the book. But anyway, my favourite character in this book is actually Percival Everett himself. He writes himself into this book kind of in a self-deprecating way. He's a professor, which Percival Everett is a professor. But in this one, the character of Percival Everett is a professor of nonsense. So all of the lectures that not Sidney Poitier goes to are nonsense. And he asks interesting questions in these lectures, and Percival Everett gives them nonsensical answers that still also kind of mean something. It just sort of lets you sit there and go, he's not taking this very seriously, but he's trying to get you to think about something in an unserious way seriously. Does that make any sense? Not really? Read the book. I think what I like most about Percival Everett is kind of a theme that I like in everything comedic, is something that doesn't take itself or things seriously, but presents ideas in a kind of skewed, ridiculous way that makes the mundane seem very, very stupid or silly. In that way, it challenges just regular conventions and societal conventions. Not Sidney Poitier is a little bit naive as a character. He's naive, he's sort of innocent. He's never really been challenged in his life because he's also kind of a genius. And this little journey that he goes on makes him question his own privilege, but his own privilege as a black man in certain areas that really don't accept him as a black man, much less a rich black man. It just creates these very interesting little situations. So yeah, I think this one was really good too. It's not my favourite that I've read of his, but it's very Percival Everett. It's got his voice, it's got his style, it's got his humour that I enjoy. It's not as absurd. I think the situation is absurd, but once you're 50 pages in, you just sort of forget about the fact that his name is not Sidney Poitier, even though he has to explain that to many people. But there's also like some darkness in here, you know? There's some really dark racism in here. There's some very unsettling sexual abuse in it, but it never goes into territories of being utterly depressing. That was my Percival Everett journey this month.
Next thing I read was not really random shit. I also read 3 books by the same author in January, and that author was Dennis Lehane. And in February, I continued to do so. I only read 1 book by him, and that was A Drink Before the War, which is his first novel published in the 90s. And it's also the first in his 6-book series about two detectives called Kenzie and Gennaro, Patrick Kenzie and Angela Gennaro, which is his more, I guess, traditional 2 detectives solving a case in every book. But that being said, even though it's his debut, he has always been good. And it's his classic characterization that's there from page 1. I got attached to these two characters exceptionally quickly. And that is what carries me through a lot of Dennis Lehane. Like, I enjoy his mysteries and his plotting and his settings and all those things, but mostly his characters are very believable. He writes them in a way that is exceptionally natural. It never feels like somebody is writing them. It feels like these people are just there and he just found them and is presenting them to you. And that's the case with this book as well. I do think it's probably it is on the lower end of my ranking, if I had one, of Dennis Lehane books I've read so far. This is the 6th one I've read. But that is still a very, very good book. It's just a more, I guess, predictable plot and mystery. It's just, like I said, a bit more straightforward in terms of what the book is. But it hooked me immediately on the characters, and that's all you really need for a long-ish crime series. So it's pretty likely that I will be reading all of the Kenzie and Gennaro books this year. I think that will happen. There's 5 more. One of them you might know is Gone Baby Gone, which has a pretty famous movie adaptation, which I've never seen. So I'm excited to read all of those. It's a really good book if you've been sampling some Dennis Lehane and you're not sure where to continue or if this is a good one to pick up. It absolutely is. And like a lot of crime series, it's a one-off every time and you just have character arcs developing over the full series, but each one has an ending in terms of like wrapping up the storyline of that particular book. There's not a noticeable drop in quality because we're going back in time in his writing career. It's just a little bit less ambitious. I was about to say this cements him as a favorite writer. I think I've said that with the last 3 books of his that I've read, so I can stop saying that now. But what it does do and confirm is that I don't think there will be any Dennis Lehane books that I don't like.
Since I discovered a new favorite writer early on this year in Percival Everett, and I sort of blasted through 5 of his books, I figured I'd revisit an old favorite and read more of his books, and I've kind of done just that, and that is Adrian Tchaikovsky. And I picked up Ogres. I made a little video. I didn't give too much away about this book. Like I said in that little 6-minute video, if you want to go watch that, you're best not knowing anything about this book before you read it. But I think this is extremely timely, relevant to where we are in the political, economical world today. If you are in any way disillusioned with where we are in said world with said issues, read this book, pick it up. It'll get you thinking. It'll like any good work of science fiction, it's fairly allegorical to where we are and where we might be going. And it works on a lot of levels. If you like fantasy or science fiction or a blend of the two genres, or where does, magic and technology cross, read this book. If you like rebellions, read this book.
Yes.
I was happy to get back to Tchaikovsky, who was another one of my favorite authors. I want to read a few Tchaikovskys this year. I kind of settled on a bit of a plan for myself this year of going back to some favorite authors and really going through their back catalogue and really reading more from each of the authors that I kind of consider favorites or easy go-tos. And because of that, I picked up the latest release by Adrian Tchaikovsky as well, called Shroud. I am only 30 pages into this book, so I'll update again in the next wrap-up. But I'm very much liking this as well. The tone, the vibe of it, it's very Alien, the 1979 movie. Shroud is about a group of scientists who are sent out to look for hospitable worlds, and they find this moon orbiting a gas giant that seems to be sending out a lot of radio waves, but it's cloaked in darkness. And they can't really see through the biosphere, but there seems to be a lot of shit going on. And they're kind of orbiting it, sending in drones. The drones are getting destroyed, but one drone comes back with some interesting images. And now they want to see what's down there, and they call this little moon Shroud. Very fucking cool so far, very mysterious, I reckon it's going to be quite sci-fi horror. So yeah, I'll update you how I get on with that over the next month.
The next thing I read, I won't spend too much time on because I made a video about it, and that is Human Acts by Han Kang. Han Kang is a writer from South Korea. She won the Nobel Prize in Literature in 2024, and this is a part of my project to read every Nobel Prize winner. I tried The Vegetarian last year. Was a mixed bag for me, didn't quite connect with it. Human Acts is my second attempt, and this book was tremendous. Dark and grim and kind of depressing and maybe a tiny bit hopeful, I'm not sure, but an impressive bit of writing. It's set in 1980 in Korea, or in South Korea. At least that's where it starts, and then we progress throughout each chapter. And it's about, I guess, student uprising in Gwangju in Korea in 1980 that was very, very violently suppressed by the military. So that's where the grimness comes from. But Han Kang's writing style, which is quite poetic without ever being flowery or pretentious, suits that tone extremely well. And it got me hooked, even though I was also feeling this really oppressive atmosphere from reading about this darkness and being so immersed in it. She plays around with narrator a lot. She has like first person, third person, second person all mixed in this book, and connected characters coming back and forth, and it really pulls you from one place to another, exactly to where she wants to have you as a reader. So I read the first probably like 60-70% extremely quickly in like a day, and then I had to put it down because it was just too depressing. I had to take a moment and a breather, because between like things happening in the world in general and then reading a really depressing book, it was really affecting my mood. And I realized, okay, I need to cleanse my, not quite my palate yet because I haven't finished it, but just my mind, I suppose, and my soul, and read something a little bit happy and joyful. So I paused it for a day and blasted through Will They or Won't They by Ava Wilder, which is a contemporary romance. And I enjoy a good contemporary romance that I can read in 24 hours and just get sucked into. And that's exactly what this was. It was kind of perfect for exactly what I wanted. It's I don't know what the term is for, I'm sure there is one, like a celebrity romance. Love in the public eye, I think is what people call it. Anyway, it's about two people who are...
That's a thing?
Yeah, that's a thing.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, apparently. They are co-stars in a supernatural drama TV series, and their characters have this will they or won't they thing over seasons and seasons, and they hate each other. She eventually leaves the show and is now coming back for the last season and dreading having to work with him again, and that's where the book starts. And honestly, a big attraction from it was that the show, the way it's described, is obviously not that, but it really reminded me of the Vampire Diaries. So that's what I was picturing the entire time, and it added just a little personal bit of amusement to my experience reading this book. Not much more to say about it. It satisfied the craving I had for romance. I think Ava Wilder has only read 2 books, and I've written 2 books. I assume she's read a few more. But I have read both of them.
What the fuck was that?
I think we should leave that in exactly like that.
Yeah.
And I wouldn't put her on the pedestal that I have Emily Henry on in terms of writing romance, because Emily Henry has me engaged until the last page, and I find that with some other romance that I've read, once I see that everything is resolved-ish and they're getting together, I'm just kind of done. So it would be a minor criticism for me for this book, and why it wouldn't be like a 5-star read and more in the 4-star territory, or like an 7 to 8 out of 10, probably an 8 out of 10. I think we lose the tension of not knowing if they will get together too soon. And obviously we know that they're going to get together because it's contemporary romance, but a really good writer will be able to make you question it, even if you're not really questioning it. But it did exactly what I needed it to do. I thought that the romance between the two of them was believable, and also the reason why they don't just like meet, get together, and that's it was also believable, which is the two main things that you need for a successful romance. So that was Will They or Won't They by Ava Wilder. Once my mind and soul were successfully cleansed and back in a more joyful spirit after reading 400 pages of contemporary romance in 20 hours, I was able to go back to Human Acts and finish this. And I think, like I said, it's a great, great book. Make sure you're in the right headspace and in the mood to be depressed and for it to be very grim. It literally opens with a pile of dead bodies, but it's a great book that is worth your time. And I think Han Kang is an incredible writer. Who would have thought? Nobel Prize winner, good writer. So if you want to know more about my thoughts about it, you can watch the video.
So like I said, I feel like I was hitting a bit of a slump in terms of paying attention to novels and prose and that kind of thing. And I decided, okay, it's time for me to pick up a comic. And I picked up a graphic novel that got a lot of critical acclaim maybe 2-3 years ago. And that is Ducks by Kate Beaton. It's actually Ducks 2 Years in the Oil Sands is the name of this little graphic novel. It's a graphic memoir. So this is actually a memoir told in comic form, cartoonist form. For the first 200 pages, it's about 450 pages, but for the first 200 pages I thought the panel to panel rhythm and dialogue and kind of scene to scene shifting was a little jagged and jarring. I was struggling to really get into it, but I liked some of the dialogue and the kind of look at Canadian culture and kind of the little subcultures within Canada. And obviously dialogue and dialect is a big thing that I'm into, and I like seeing how different like cultures speak to each other and how does that define their culture and that kind of thing. And there's very cool little tidbits about the Atlantic provinces in Canada and the kind of dialects that exist in Newfoundland and Nova Scotia and those kinds of places. Exceptionally Irish. Clearly heavily influenced by Irish immigration in the 1850s. But I wasn't really getting into the story yet, or into what it was that Kate Beaton was trying to tell me. And then something happens at about the halfway point that is a bit of a gut puncher. And you're in it then. I think this is a very important book. To explain the subtitle a little bit, 2 Years in the Oil Sands, and the fact that this is a memoir. This is about Kate Beaton going to work in the oil fields in Alberta, Canada, basically to have opportunity for herself, to pay off her student loans. There's not a lot of job opportunities in the Atlantic provinces to earn good money. This is kind of set in 2004-ish era. Oil is the big industry in sort of interior Canada. And she goes and she works on these sort of remote oil sands as somebody who works in kind of the supplies department. So she sits behind a counter with all these like bits of equipment and supplies and tools, and the sort of drillers and people working with the oil directly come and looking for tools, come to ask her for tools. They're like, oh, can I get a 720, whatever. She works there for 2 years, and this is her experience there. Why does this matter? Well, these remote oil sands are very male dominated, and you go there and you work for sort of months on end before you get any kind of break or break for Christmas or whatever, and you're there in a sort of commune. They live in digs on site. Out of maybe 100 men, there might be 2 women. This kind of remote, dangerous work out there for a long time, basic kind of, societal norms about behavior start to dissipate a little bit. And obviously you pair that with, highly charged testosterone-filled environment. If a woman shows up, the men will be very openly, not necessarily praying after her, not everybody, there is certainly that in this book, but even just casual bits of staring at her too long, saying inappropriate things, but more heightened than in regular workplace harassment. And it's sort of really interesting in the sense that Kate Beaton is very empathetic towards this because she understands the context of this environment, but she also goes to the dark places and the hidden nastiness and kind of evil underneath all of this sort of mundane politeness and, oh, we're just joking. And it's very, very good. And then the second half of the book, the dialogue is razor sharp, really impactful. And her account of being sexually assaulted on the site is really, really powerful and impactful. It's not graphic. She doesn't go into any detail, but leaves it there. And then the second half of the book is kind of dealing with the trauma of it and dealing with the fact that this happened and figuring it out. Maybe keeping it to herself, maybe not. Does she have support? All this kind of stuff. Is it swept under the rug? Do the people that did it actually think they did it? Or was it just a nice evening where everybody was drinking? She looks at all of the swirling complexities and nuances about that, and honestly does it really, really well. This is a very important book, and done very simply and eloquently with a lot of compassion and empathy all around, to be honest. But it's quite an interesting book just about how that kind of social experiment of putting people in this place for so long, doing a dangerous job, a lot of loneliness, examinations of loneliness, and what it kind of does to people. And if you have any kind of darkness in you and you get to that lonely, dark place, does that come out and do you accidentally hurt people? And then obviously there's very bad stuff that happens with people that are probably genuinely bad people. But there's a lot of nuance to it all. And I kind of forgot about all the sort of criticisms that I had early on in the book and then just sort of flew through the last bit of it. I still think that maybe some of her sort of scene-to-scene pacing, the paneling, is a little jarring. You can't quite situate yourself sometimes. But I would say power through to the middle of the book, and then, yeah, what she's going for will really hit afterwards. It's impactful. That's it. Ducks. Really good graphic novel. Graphic memoir, sorry. Not a novel. True story. So, yeah. Ducks. Highly recommend it.
Well, I also read 2 comics. I'll talk about both of them pretty briefly. The first one I want to talk about is American Vampire by Scott Snyder and Stephen King. So this is a longer series, but this is volume 1, which collects the first 12 issues. And the first 6 of those are co-written between Scott Snyder and Stephen King, and after that, it's just Scott Snyder.
So I've only read the issues with Snyder and King so far as well, because we were reading it together with our buddy John.
Yeah. And as you could gather from the title, it's about vampires in America.
Haha.
Haha. Good things first, I think the art is great, genuinely creepy at times, and really suits the tone. The tone is the next thing I really like. There is a Western flavor to it and some horror, and these are really scary vampires. So it is American fiction. It's very, Western, early 20th century America mostly, with vampires thrown in. And mostly going scene to scene. Every scene is good, but I found the overall storytelling to be a little bit disjointed and going back and forth, and I wasn't really sure what the actual through line was. I mean, I could recognize some in terms of like a character and obviously the vampires of it all, but I couldn't really tell you who's the main character and what do they want and what's the main like goal here. And that changed a little bit in the second half when it was just one writer. I think maybe the issue was Scott Snyder and Stephen King taking turns writing bits and pieces. And it just felt very much like 2 people writing and pulling in different directions. My criticism doesn't fully go away, but in the second half of the book, there was more cohesive storytelling overall and some really good issues and some really good moments and emotional moments too. So overall, a mixed bag, but I did enjoy reading it mostly, and I'm glad that I finished it because it took me a while to read. I took a long break to read some other stuff, and I read actually the second half this morning, and I'm glad I did, and I think reading that in one go kind of helped me get back into it. The second comic I read was the first deluxe volume of Criminal by Ed Brubaker and Sean Phillips. We've talked about this before on the channel. You've talked about this before on the channel. And I have finally picked it up, and it's great. It is a crime comic series, and we have recurring characters, but each 6-issue arc is kind of its own contained thing. So this has the first 3 arcs. I've read the first 2. We'll probably read the third one this evening, so I just figured I'd throw it into this wrap-up. But it's a very noir crime story, street level, people backstabbing each other, people shifting alliances. And it's great. It's exactly my kind of tone for crime. And I'm glad that I'm reading it. I've read Ed Brubaker and Sean Phillips before with their series Velvet, also published by Image, which was really good. That was spies. So yeah, not much more to say at this time. I'm really enjoying it, and I shall be reading more.
So I got a craving for a little bit of comfort food. We were kind of redoing some shelves a little bit here at home, and we have kind of 2 little shelves dedicated to Star Wars books and comics. And I was looking at it going, right, well, I want to get to the New Jedi Order series, which is kind of the sequel series, big long sequel series to the original trilogy that was written in the 90s. But I've built up a little bit of a timeline in my head of books, and I've read several, but I wanted to get back to it and fill those little gaps in my timeline of my Star Wars headcanon. So I read Dark Apprentice, which is the second book in the Jedi Academy trilogy, which is basically a trilogy about Luke Skywalker setting up a new Jedi Academy, recruiting new potential Jedi and Force users. And I did not like the first book in this trilogy, really. So I was maybe going to skip the entire thing, but I figured they're Star Wars books. Some of them are going to be bad, and some will be good. The very least that I expect from these books is a fun story and competent writing. This one I really enjoyed, but it's got some bad writing. This is not a great book, but I had a great time because it's exactly what I needed at the time. It's a compelling story, even though it's fairly predictable. Also, one of Luke Skywalker's students laughably turns to the dark side in like 2 pages. Arrives in the academy, is like, no, Luke's not teaching me anything. I turned to the dark side. It's really kind of funny, actually, but I actually really enjoyed it. Because it was so silly. I don't know, everything to do with Luke and Han, Leia and Lando, I really enjoy it. It's nice to be back with them. So I'm going to carry on. I will read the third book in the Jedi Academy trilogy, even though Kevin J. Anderson is just not a writer that I really think is good. I don't want to be skipping stuff that I, was set on reading anyway, and I'm going to do a huge read-through over the next however many years it takes. So yeah, this was really fun. If you like Star Wars, maybe don't start here. But yeah, read the Thrawn trilogy, absolutely, by Timothy Zahn. The real 7, 8, and 9, in my opinion.
Last but not least, I read another fantasy this month. We are back. We're back. If anybody was worried about me picking up a adult fantasy for the first time in 9 months and being lukewarm on it with Babel last month, worry not. There were some people, 2 or 3 people in the comments of my review of Babel that mentioned a book that they said had some of the similar themes and atmosphere as Babel, if not the translation aspect, and did it better. There were actually a lot of recommendations, though. Thank you for anyone who left a comment. That was really cool. I have a long list. And I decided to pick up one of them, and that was Blood Over Bright Haven by M.L. Wang. M.L. Wang also wrote The Sword of Kaigen, which was self-published. This was also originally self-published and was just released by Del Rey. Since I've brought it up, I will compare it to Babel briefly, but I don't want to make that the whole point of me talking about this book. It doesn't use translation as magic at all, but other than that, in terms of themes, it's very close to Babel. It is talking about things like misogyny, colonialism, class, race, and how all of those issues intersect. And it does that a lot better than Babel. I think it's not necessarily much more subtle because those themes are very prominent and obvious, but it is a lot more nuanced and it's a lot more smooth because it feels natural in the way this world is set up and the way the characters are navigating it. I actually don't want to say too much about it because I plan to make a video because I did really, really love this book and I have some stuff to say, but I don't want to make this wrap up even longer than it already is. So it'll go in its own video. What I will say though is this also has a dark academia aspect to it. We have 2 main characters and then obviously a supporting cast. But it has one of my favorite first chapters that I've read recently this year for sure, and a very nice full circle structure to the story. And I really loved this book so much. Oh, was it my book of the month? I'm not sure. I need to think about that. Very good. Book good. Book very good.
Well, I started the month wanting to read another fantasy, and a fantasy that I've specifically been wanting to read for a while because it's written by a countryman of mine, and that's The Gutter Prayer by Gareth Hanrahan. I kind of parked it to read my little bit of Star Wars and my comics and that kind of thing, but I'm back to it now and I'm well in. I'm over 100 pages in, and this is a very, very cool book so far. Gareth Hanrahan is an Irish author who writes a lot of stories for tabletop role-playing games and other sort of gaming. He's a gaming writer, and this is his debut fantasy novel from a few years ago, and it's really cool. So it's based in a city called Guerdon, which feels like sort of Gormenghast inspired, multiple layers and levels to the city, but like Edinburgh. But Gareth Hanrahan himself says it's based on his home city of Cork, down in southwest Ireland. And I see it. It's an old city built on hills with multiple layers and levels to it. But the tone of this is very much, if you like Dark Souls, Bloodborne, those video games, or if you like Lovecraft-style horror with really creative magical creatures, if you like a bit of noir detective in that setting, this is going to be your thing. And this is certainly my thing so far. So I'll have more to say about that in the next wrap up. I just wanted to give it a quick highlight shout out now because I think it's really good. And he's Irish. I think my book of the month is either Wounded or Ogres.
Nice.
Can't separate them right now.
Mine is either Planetfall or Blood Over Brighthaven.
Cool.
With Human Acts a close third.
Right.
I had a great month, I have to say. Like any other month, A Drink Before the War could have been book of the month.
Cool. Good month then.
Good month. Shall we wrap it up?
Yes, let's wrap it up. So comment down below, what did you read in February? Did you have you read any of the things that we read? What did you think of them? Let us know. And like the video if you liked it. If you didn't like it, dislike it. And if you're just found us, subscribe, stick around. We usually have wrap-ups that are this chaotic. That's kind of our thing. So we'll see you next time for some more chaos. And more videos coming soon, little reviews, whatever. All that stuff. We'll see you next time. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.
Bye. And I finally picked it up, and I think I'd been delaying picking it up because...
Something in my eye.
Oh.
There's your outtake right there.
I'm like not a normal person.